Roll it up there for us.
Pizza party.
Pizza party just got
How do you like it?
tastier. The only undefeated team, the Clemson Tigers, potentially, depending on how the rankings come out, they could have 3 top 10 wins. At worst, I'd say 3 top 12 wins on their.
What do you say, meat lovers today for the
meat lovers even taste good, right?
Oh, they're going crazy.
Don't want to eat broccoli there. You think they like it in Death Valley?
Oh, that's awesome.
They have waited for this, and certainly with Dabo Swinney as head coach, Clemson's had terrific success. But they haven't won a national championship since Danny Ford was leading the way, Homer Jordan, 1981. It's been a while. They've got a chance.
Something to remember about Dabo Swinney and Clemson. Last 5 years, they've averaged a 10-2 season. That's 5th best in all of college football. This is not just this year. He's been building this for a while.
No question. Alabama, Oregon, Clemson coming into this year are the only ones that continue to put together 10-win seasons year after year. So the Tigers, their closest bowl game in the national semifinal on New Year's Eve, the Capital One Orange Bowl. So they'll be headed down to South Florida. Traditional ACC matchup, too.
Call your travel agent. They can now officially get your hotel, get your flights. You're heading to Miami.
They got to put the pizza down.
Yeah.
Start making.
You better get on that phone right now.
So Clemson is number 1. Now number 2. Is there a little drama there?
Oh, yeah. Here we go.
It is Alabama.
Somebody call Nick and let him know there, too. Well, yeah.
There's the drama coming at 3 and 4. These two were expected. Now it's going to be interesting.
Yeah, so Alabama back-to-back SEC champions. They'll be going back to Dallas Goodyear Cotton Bowl, as Kirk alluded to earlier, familiar with the venue. They opened the season there against Wisconsin, and now will play on New Year's Eve on ESPN in one national semifinal there. So the Crimson Tide, when they get to Dallas, no big watch party for them, as Kaylee told us. Business as usual. Tide, the only team to go back-to-back and make the playoff. Who's number 3? Who will Alabama face?
Ooh.
Michigan State makes the jump.
Ooh.
Nick Saban against the school he used to coach. Mark D'Antonio is on his staff.
Yep.
And this is a much different Michigan State program than the last time they met in the postseason was after the 2010 season when Alabama blitzed them 49-7.
Mark D'Antonio, there's a reaction there in East Lansing. Mark D'Antonio took a lot away from Jim Tressel, but a lot also away from Nick Saban at a time that he was with him. That'll be a great matchup, a physical matchup.
And how about for the second straight year, we also get the SEC and the Big Ten international semifinal. Last year, Ohio State took down the Tide on its way to the championship. So that means Clemson on New Year's Eve will start its path for the championship against Boomer's coming here, right? Oklahoma. So no surprises in the top 4. We expected this. Sooners, 1 year and 2 days after getting annihilated by Clemson in the postseason. And by the way, Clemson without Deshaun Watson in the postseason last year, 40-6. Chance for a little redemption for the Sooners against.
I really think that loss had a lot to do with the changes. Lincoln Riley coming in. All the things that they did in the offseason were a result from their last time they played against Clemson.
If I'm Michigan State, and I said this last year, when the Big Ten goes against the SEC in this style of game, because it's a physical running style of game, if I'm Michigan State, I would like to see Alabama because that's the style of offense they've been facing all year long. Power football between the tackles.
Yeah, well, you're playing power football, but you're not playing with exactly the same players. It's going to be when we've seen Alabama struggle typically. If I'm looking at this board and I'm an Alabama fan, I don't want to play Deshaun Watson a mobile threat or Baker Mayfield a mobile threat. Connor Cook, I think it's a better matchup. It's a more favorable matchup. They're trying to do the same thing, but Alabama's a more talented team, a more skilled team. In the trenches, the depth that they have, they can play man coverage. It's just that's a good matchup for Alabama. If I was picking any team, that's who I'd want if I was them.
And when we're talking style, though, and if I'm a defensive coach and I have to go against these quarterbacks, you said Deshaun Watson, you talked about Baker Mayfield, Oklahoma. Yeah. If I'm Michigan State and you talk style and what I'm used to coaching against, what I'm used to seeing every single weekend, I want Alabama because that's the style that I'm used to being able and gearing my team to get ready to stop.
Well, what you're saying is Michigan State prides itself on stopping the run.
Absolutely.
That's their entire defensive package. It has been since Dino's been there, and Alabama has to run the ball.
Yep.
So it's going to be a lot like what Michigan State faced yesterday against Iowa. Yeah. Same type of philosophy.
Ohio State, same thing.
I agree with what you're saying. I think there's motivation for both teams. Alabama lost to a Big Ten team last year. And Michigan State, all they hear about is the SEC. So there's going to be a lot of motivation, I think, for both of those teams. And I think the Oklahoma-Clemson game has a chance to be very intriguing, too, because of the quarterback play, the way they'll spread you out, the chance to be able to put points up on the board. It's going to be a shootout. Very different, kind of a contrast in styles in these two semifinal games.
Who does a better job in big games and playing the chip on your shoulder than D'Antonio?
Oh,
Urban
Meyer did last year.
Last 7 matchups versus top 5 opponents, he's 6-1. And what are we going to hear for the next 20-something days? Michigan State has absolutely no shot. It works perfect for Michigan State. D'Antonio, how they function the best over the next 26 days will be perfect for them.
All right, Goodyear Mort-driven debate now about the top 4 that we have. Joey, I want to start with you here. Let's take a step back and go big picture. And we touched on this before we revealed the top 4. There will be conspiracy theorists out there who say that the committee moved Oklahoma behind Michigan State to avoid Alabama-Oklahoma in the national semifinals. Do you agree, or is this a completely justified move based on what Michigan State accomplished?
I think it's a justified move, and I talked about it early on before we even seen the rankings. If you look at Michigan State's resume, and we've always said, and you've preached this to me, that these committee members go in the room and start fresh every single week. Now that Michigan State is the Big Ten champ, now that you look at their resume with the teams on it, Ohio State, Michigan, Iowa at the end at number 4, Michigan State, I wouldn't even been surprised to see Michigan State even have the ability to go to number 2. Having them come in at number 3 and jumping Oklahoma is not a surprise to me. They've earned it, and their resume says they deserve it.
You know how evenly matched these teams are. If you look at the FPI, which is a forward-looking measure, a predictive measure, you know who the number 1 team in the country is in FPI? It's the team that's number 4 in the playoff. Oklahoma sits on top of the FPI. So no conspiracy theories here. We've got 2 great semifinal matchups. You talked about the way Oklahoma changed its mindset, largely based on what happened to Clemson last year against Clemson when they played in the Russell Athletic Bowl. How does Stoops use that? Everything's different for them now. Things are different for Clemson now, too. How do you use that?
In college football, with long layoffs, motivation becomes kind of the secret ingredient. Whichever coach can find a way, however long, how many days do we have between 20 to 30 days, however long this is until we get these games, the chance to watch them play. Whoever has a team that shows up early to look at film, that doesn't complain about practice, that is focused, that is locked in, that's the team that has the edge. So you got to look at these teams. Is Clemson going to have to try to create nobody respects us type of thing? For Oklahoma, it's very clear. This team embarrassed you a year ago. A lot of you were on the field last year against this team. This is your chance to get that redemption. So, yeah, I always look for intangibles when it used to come to the BCS championship games, and now that it comes to the playoff, I think for Oklahoma, it won't take a lot for Bob Stoops to get his boys ready to play.
David, you and I have talked a lot over the last few weeks about the potential for Clemson's defense wearing down. You played defensive line. There's a lot of effort that goes into playing that position. You don't have time to recover during the season.
No.
Clemson doesn't have the depth that it had last year on that defensive front, but they've got a lot of talent. How does the layoff help them in terms of recovery?
Well, now you get to get your legs back. I mean, this is a huge opportunity for you to sit back, get off the couch. It's not the week-to-week grind. You're not going 5-6 days a week. So it's obviously a huge thing. And when it goes to motivation, like Kirk was talking about too, I don't think it matters on the field. Mm-hmm. It's not one of those things where they roll the ball out there and all of a sudden you have more motivation and you're going to beat somebody. But the preparation, when you're told you can't do something as a player, you know what I'm doing? If I'm worried, I'm watching tape more. Yeah. I'm spending more time in the film room to make sure I get more keys, and everything the coach says to me, I'm listening to and I'm digesting, because I know it might come down to one play, as opposed to when I'm the favorite, hey, you're going to win, you're going to take care of business. I'm less inclined to do those extra things that mean, sometimes the difference in a game.
On the subject of the favorites, that has been established very quickly. The Bear, Chris Felikas, passing along to me.
Where's the Bear cam?
In one national semifinal, probably what you would expect in the Goodyear Cotton Bowl, Alabama is a 9-point favorite over Michigan State. But the other one, the 4-seed Oklahoma, is a 2.5-point favorite over Clemson to open.
There's that FPI.
Orange Bowl.
FPI.
There you go. Huh? It's forward-looking, and it does reflect. It doesn't reflect because it's a different thing, but it mirrors in some ways mirrors in some ways what the Vegas rankings would be.
Yeah, and you know what? And when you look at the Big Ten SEC matchup, I believe Alabama was like an 8-point favorite last year against Ohio State. And when I'm looking matchups, and I'm thinking as a coach, I'm thinking as players, and I look at the teams I want to play, it's not just about the talent on the other side. When you talk about preparation, you talk about having to watch film. If I'm watching film of a team that is like the teams that I've played, we don't have to create new defenses. We don't have to create new offenses. We just have to get good and get better at what we've already set up ourselves to do. It's when you face a team that is not similar to what you've been facing all year long, is now when you got to go back to the drawing board and say, we're going to come with something different. We're going to come with a whole new style to try to stop one of these offenses. In these cases, these matchups, all four of these teams have seen this same similar style that they'll be facing.
Michigan State ain't scared. I can promise you that. They were 2-touchdown dog to Ohio State. This is what they've done with big games. They're not going to.
They're more in a comfort zone.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Antonio loves this.
Oh, yeah.
He hopes the spread gets bigger.
They're going to play clips of everybody talking about them all week, about being the worst team in the Final Four, no shot against Alabama. They're going to do that for the next 3 weeks.
All right, plenty of time to talk about this. We want to bring in right now the chairman of the College Football Playoff Selection Committee, Jeff Long, who joins us now. And, Jeff, certainly there is not the same type of controversy as when we were at this point a year ago. But the decision I do want to ask you about what it was like in the room. What was it that carried the day for Michigan State to move them ahead of Oklahoma and to get that 3 spot?
Well, that's probably where we spent the most of the time, Reese, as you would expect. And great discussion, great debate. Both conference champions, both 4 wins over top 25 teams. But what it came down to is really Michigan State with 2 top 10 wins and then adding a win over last week's number 4 ranked team. So I think when you looked at the body of work, the complete resume, that's what pushed Michigan State just slightly ahead of Oklahoma. And again, Oklahoma, Big 12 conference champ, was an outstanding season, great body of work, but just that little bit of difference pushed Michigan State ahead.
Okay, now last week you alluded to the fact that there was a lot of conversation about Alabama perhaps passing Clemson. How would you characterize that debate in the room?
Not this week. Clearly, Clemson number 1, 3 top 10 victories on their resume now, undefeated, ACC champs. Really very little discussion. Certainly we went over it, but clearly Clemson number 1 team in the nation.
Okay, you've mentioned resume twice to both of my questions. Was there any sentiment in the room, because we just talked about the FPI, we talked about Oklahoma maybe being the hottest team. Was there anybody who stood up in the room and said, you know what, Oklahoma's the best team?
Oh, there were people in the room that felt like after all of this that Oklahoma could be the number 1 team. No question. As you mentioned, they're balanced offense and defense. They've got an explosive offense. And again, it's hard to express, but all 4 of these teams very close. But little differences in that resume, in the number of wins, how they won those games that made the difference. But certainly, I can tell you there were people in that room that believed Oklahoma could be the number 1 team.
I couldn't coax it out of you on College Game Day Saturday, but now, was there ever a question that the Big Ten championship game was a de facto quarterfinal play-in game?
We don't look at it that way, but certainly it played out that way with Michigan State's win.
Jeff,
Give it up.
Were the 4 teams as clear-cut as we thought? Was there any debate about Ohio State, about Stanford getting into the mix?
Certainly, we discussed those teams, but I don't think I could characterize it that Stanford and Ohio State were close to getting into the top 4, no.
Okay, what was the biggest challenge presented in trying to line up these teams as it pertains to seeding?
You know, I do think that we don't look at seeding, really. We don't. I know that there's people out there that, as you guys were talking about conspiracies, there's certainly none in that room. Our charge is rank that number 1 team through 4, best 4 teams, and that's what we did. What happens after the placement in the semifinals, you know, that takes care of itself. But we really do focus, and I made it clear as we started that portion of the meeting, we're to rank those 4 best teams, and I believe the committee has done that.
Okay, we're not going to reveal the rest of your rankings until a little bit later on in the afternoon. It seems that the 4 teams, maybe not the order, but the selection of the 4 teams was the easy part. What about ranking the teams below them? How would you characterize that, namely Stanford, Ohio State, and Iowa after that near miss in the Big Ten championship game last night?
You're right, Reese. We're going to reveal that a little bit later. But, you know, those were difficult discussions, no question. There's a lot of variables in there, and we spent a lot of time on that, say, 5 through 8, 5 through 10. And then a couple other places throughout the top 25. So when we unveil that, you'll see why we had some very difficult discussions. You know, head-to-heads were some particularly issues in that remainder of the top 25.
Hey, Jeff, how would you characterize, just kind of putting a bow on this in a big picture, how would you characterize the difficulty of the decisions made this year in the second year of the playoff with what you had to do where selection was more controversial a year ago?
Yeah, two very different years, Reese. I would say in some ways last year was more difficult. This year was less so, but there's always nuances in each one of these as you look at the top 4 and then through the top 25. It's always going to be challenging because there's so many teams that are so close and so little difference between those resumes that each year is going to be challenging. But if you ask me to say which one was a little more challenging, I'd say last year.
All right, that is Jeff Long, the chairman of the College Football Playoff Selection Committee. Jeff is going to be back during the 3 o'clock hour after we reveal the rest of the rankings. That's 3 o'clock Eastern time, 5 through 25. And that is also the time when we'll also tell you the starting times. The kickoff.